Welcome to Signal Ahead. I'm Alfred. Today's briefing, Cryptography Academic, Monday, July 13. This is the synthesis above the noise, not the headlines, but the deep currents beneath them. Let's get into it. Good evening and welcome to Signal Ahead. I'm Alfred, and tonight we begin with a question that sounds almost too simple to be interesting. What is cryptography actually for right now in this particular moment of the discipline's history? Here is the non-obvious thing, the connection a casual reader of the technology news would almost certainly miss. If you glance at the headlines, you'd assume the great drama of the field is the arrival of quantum computers, the looming day when someone factors a large number and a great deal of the world's encryption quietly falls over. And that drama is real. But it is not, at the moment, where the intellectual energy of the field is being spent. If you actually read what cryptographers are writing this season, an overwhelming share of the work is not about protecting secrets at all. It is about a threat model that would have baffled a cryptographer of even 15 years ago. The adversary who does not want to read your message, but who wants to become your message. The adversary who is an autonomous agent, a large language model given tools, memory, and the run of the open internet, and the defender who is, very often, another such agent. Let me make that concrete, because the pattern only becomes visible when you see it repeated. Consider the problem of an AI agent browsing the web on your behalf. It inherits, immediately, the oldest wound in web security, the mixing of trusted and untrusted content, except now the untrusted content isn't a script, it's a sentence. A malicious paragraph on a web page can simply ask the agent to do something, and the agent, being a creature of language, obliges. This is prompt injection, and the defenses being proposed borrow, quite deliberately, from ideas cryptographers and systems people have refined for decades. Least privilege, confinement, the careful labeling of what may be trusted. Then consider the mirror image. Content owners who want to keep these crawling agents out, and who have discovered that the agent's own habit of compressing what it reads to fit its memory budget can be weaponized invisible perturbations that survive to a human eye but collapse into noise when the machine summarizes them. Defense by exploiting the adversary's cognition. That is a genuinely new move. And notice how the classical machinery reappears, wearing new clothes. There is work on watermarking the trajectory of an agent, the log of its actions, so that when a reseller rebrands someone's agent or quietly swaps in a cheaper model, provenance can be established. But here's the elegant cruelty of the problem. The watermark must be detected from the very evidence the adversary fully controls and can rewrite. So the designers reach for the deepest instincts of the craft, self-synchronization under deletion, invariance under rewriting, the same instincts that gave us authentication codes robust against a tampering channel. The channel, this time, is a business relationship. So the first thing to say about the state of the field is this: the object of study has shifted from the secret to the behavior. Classical cryptography asked, can an adversary learn what I know? The emerging work asks, can an adversary make my system do what it should not, and can I later prove who was responsible? Attribution, provenance, forensic tracing, failure localization in systems of many agents. These are the live verbs. When something goes wrong in a swarm of cooperating language models, the hard problem is no longer confidentiality, it is blame. Which agent, at which step, first steered the whole trajectory irrevocably astray? Now I don't want to overstate this, and I won't. The old cathedral is very much still under construction. The post-quantum transition is doing real and difficult work, and it's producing genuinely surprising results, such as the discovery that our shiny new hash-based signatures actively resist being split across multiple parties, which quietly breaks the standard way we've built digital asset custody and forces a rethink of how a quorum authorizes anything. Homomorphic encryption continues its long grind toward practicality, wrestling with the indignity that an encrypted computer can only add and multiply, so that even something as humble as an activation function must be approximated by a polynomial, with all the trade-offs that entails. Zero-knowledge proofs are being decomposed and parallelized so that a machine can prove it ran a model correctly without revealing the model. This is deep, patient, mathematical work, and it is thriving. But hold the two pictures side by side, and the tension becomes the argument I want to make across this evening. On one side, a mathematics of hard guarantees. This is impossible unless a certain problem is solved. On the other, a rapidly growing practice of soft defenses, firewalls, auditors, reputation scores, semantic filters deployed against adversaries that no clean theorem can fully capture because the adversary reasons in natural language. So the questions I want us to sit with tonight are these. Is cryptography, as a discipline, quietly annexing the whole territory of trust between reasoning machines? And if so, can it bring its habit of provable guarantees along, or must it settle in this new country for something more like vigilance? Let's find out. There is a temptation, when you survey a day's worth of cryptography papers, to see only a scattering, a watermark here, a firewall there, a bit of homomorphic encryption tucked into a corner. Noise. But if you stand back far enough and let your eyes go slightly out of focus, a shape emerges from the scatter. And the shape, I'd argue, is this. The discipline of cryptography is quietly ceasing to be about secrets and becoming instead about provenance and trust in a world where nobody quite knows who they're talking to. Consider the older bargain. Classical cryptography assumed you knew your parties. Alice and Bob, those long-suffering protagonists, wished to speak privately with an eavesdropper on the line. The whole apparatus, keys, ciphers, signatures, presumed that identity was solid, and the only problem was confidentiality. Alice was Alice. The question was merely whether Eve could listen in. But look at what troubles the field now. A watermark that must survive an adversary who has full read and write access to the very log it's detected from. That is not confidentiality. That is a desperate attempt to answer the question. Did this actually come from where it claims to come from, even when the intermediary who handles it wants to lie about the answer? An agent passes through a reseller who may rebrand it or swap the expensive model for a cheap one, and the dispute is not about secrecy, but about origin. Who made this? Whose work is this? The cryptographer is no longer guarding a message in transit. He is trying to establish paternity after the fact, in a courtroom where the defendant controls the evidence. You see the same current running through the work on consensus. The old assumption was that machines fail by crashing, they simply stop, honestly, like a fainting butler. The unsettling premise now is that machines fail by lying. Byzantine behavior, we call it, after the generals who send contradictory orders. And so a reputation model gets bolted onto the consensus core, quantifying whether a node has behaved, distinguishing, and this is the delicate part, accidental fault from actual malice. That distinction is not a mathematical one. It is very nearly a moral one. We have started asking our protocols to judge intent. And here is where the deep current becomes properly interesting, because the thing generating all this anxiety is the same thing being enlisted to solve it, the language model. Look at the shape of the defenses. A firewall that audits token flows, natural language flows, as they move toward privileged sinks. A defense that confines cross-site prompt injection by deriving trust labels for pieces of a web page. A pipeline that turns legacy documentation into machine-readable compliance artifacts while trying desperately not to hallucinate a vulnerability into existence. In every case, the threat surface is not code, not ciphertext, but meaning, prose. The instruction and the data have collapsed into the same substance, and cryptography, a field built on the crisp separation of the two, finds itself asked to police semantics. This is a genuine inversion. For decades, the great triumph of the discipline was to reduce trust to mathematics. You did not need to trust the person, you needed only to verify the signature. Trust was mechanized, exiled from the messy human realm into the clean realm of number theory. What I'm suggesting is that the current work is smuggling trust back in because the new adversary does not attack the mathematics. The mathematics is fine. Ed 25519 signs a QR code beautifully, the elliptic curves hold. The adversary instead attacks the seams, the reseller's log, the agent's context window, the mini-program's misuse of an OAuth flow, the human being who scans a spoofed code at a parking machine and trusts it because it looks ordinary. The attack has migrated from the cipher to the context around the cipher. And notice how the defenses accordingly become probabilistic, forensic, reputational words that would have made an earlier generation of cryptographers wince. Forensic attribution of a backdoored code completion, tracing a poisoned output back to its tainted training data. Failure localization in a multi-agent system, asking which agent broke the system and at what step it first went irreversibly wrong. These are not proofs, they are investigations. The cryptographer is becoming, of all things, a detective, and behind the detective stands the older figure still, the one who deals in certainty, in the threshold seal jointly produced from shared secrets, in the zero-knowledge proof decomposed into pieces so it can actually be computed. So the two halves coexist uneasily. On one side, the hard mathematical machinery, made post-quantum, made parallel, made efficient. On the other, this soft new frontier of meaning and intent and provenance, where the guarantees grow fuzzier the moment a language model enters the room. The deep current, then, is a migration of the trust problem, outward from the algorithm, into the ecosystem, and finally into language itself, the last place a cryptographer ever wanted to have to stand guard. What that costs us, and whether the old certainties can be extended to cover it, is where we must turn next. What ties this whole collection together, and I think it's worth naming plainly as we close, is a quiet migration in where we've decided the boundary of trust actually sits. For most of the history of this field, the boundary was a wall. You had your system, you had the outside, and cryptography was the mortar between the stones. Encrypt the channel, sign the message, verify the certificate, and the wall held. What we're watching now is the dissolution of that wall into something more like a nervous system trust, distributed across thousands of small, continuous judgments, made at runtime about content whose provenance we can no longer take on faith. Consider the through line, a consensus protocol that no longer assumes its participants merely crash, but assumes some of them lie, and so it must maintain a running reputation, a ledger of behavior, penalizing the malicious while forgiving the merely unlucky. A firewall that inspects not packets, but meaning, watching natural language, tokens flow between an agent's memory, its tools, and its actions, trying to catch an unsafe intention before it reaches something privileged. A defense for web agents that grants least privilege not by static rule, but by reasoning, on the fly, about which parts of a page it dares to believe. Notice what these have in common. They have all given up on the idea that you can decide, in advance, and once, what is safe. They are auditing continuously, because the threat is now semantic, and the threat is now inside. And here is the second-order implication I'd ask you to sit with. When trust becomes a continuous judgment about meaning, the adversary's most powerful move is no longer to break a cipher, it's to control the evidence. Look at the watermarking problem for agent trajectories. The whole difficulty is that the party you're trying to hold accountable is the same party storing the log you'd use to hold them accountable. The adversary has read and write access to the very record from which guilt is read. That is a genuinely new shape of problem, and it recurs. The content protection work against agentic crawlers reaches the same conclusion from the other side. Since you cannot keep the agent out, you poison the compression step, hiding perturbations that survive into the machine's summary but never trouble the human eye. Both are conceding the same thing. The perimeter is gone. You are now fighting for control over interpretation itself, which raises the uncomfortable matter of what we're using to do the interpreting. Again and again in this material, the auditor is itself a language model. The firewall reasons semantically. The compliance pipeline reads legacy documents and emits machine-checkable artifacts. The failure localization framework asks a model to judge which agent broke the system. You're in effect deploying the very technology whose unpredictability created the problem as the instrument of its own supervision. Now, the more careful designs in this body of work know this and hedge against it, decoupling the model's reasoning from deterministic retrieval against authoritative sources, precisely so the model cannot hallucinate a vulnerability or invent an attack path. That decoupling is, I'd suggest, the single most important architectural instinct to watch going forward. The question is never merely, can the model detect the threat, but what does the system fall back to when the model is confidently wrong? Where that deterministic flaw is missing, you have built a guard who dreams. There is a quieter countercurrent here too, and I find it reassuring. Amid all this probabilistic vigilance, the hard cryptographic core has not gone soft, it has gone modular. Custody architectures that separate ordinary member authentication from a threshold seal, so that the post-quantum transition, which disrupts threshold signing, need not collapse the whole design. Proof systems for private inference decomposed into independent subproofs to reclaim the parallelism a monolithic proof denied you. Even the humble QR code, taught to carry a signature within its cruel little capacity budget, then forced to confront the real-world problem that offline signatures cannot be revoked. The lesson repeats. The mathematics still gives you certainty, but certainty is brittle unless you architect around its edges, around revocation, around the quantum horizon, around the cost of scale. So what would I watch? 3 things. First, the fate of the deterministic flaw beneath the probabilistic auditors, because a defense that is itself hallucinating is worse than none, since it manufactures false confidence. Second, the evidence control problem, because as accountability moves onto logs and trajectories, whoever holds the record holds the truth, and cryptography's next great task may be making evidence that survives its own custodian. And third, the honest reckoning with cost, which this field, to its credit, keeps forcing itself to face: the overhead of Byzantine tolerance, the prover time of zero knowledge, the approximation error you accept when you replace an activation function with a polynomial so it can be computed under encryption, because that, in the end, is the real signal ahead. Security has always been a negotiation with cost. What has changed is only the currency. We used to pay in cycles and bandwidth. We are now paying, increasingly, in interpretation, in the price of deciding, over and over, what we are willing to believe. That's the signal for today. The noise will keep coming. We'll keep finding what's underneath it. This has been Signal Ahead with Alfred. Until next time.